Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. Sarah Cross arrives with the fading light, her wheelchair glinting under the neon sign of a rundown café. Locals barely whisper her name before. The Iron Serpents, a notorious biker gang, strolling, taunting, testing, and underestimating her. She keeps her cool, every practiced breath masking the fierce determination of an undercover operative on high alert. Beyond these cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps lie deeper secrets. A corrupt pipeline of weapons, a villain pulling strings from the shadows, and a traitor who may be feeding intel to both sides. Sarah seems outmatched, but quietly, she strategizes. One slip of her cover could spark a bloody chain reaction. Why risk so much in this neglected town? Because sometimes, fighting from a wheelchair is the least surprising weapon of all. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey coming tomorrow. The bells above the entrance jingled softly as Sarah Cross maneuvered her wheelchair through the narrow doorway of Mike's General Store. The cool air inside provided a brief relief from the heat of Silver Creek's summer sun. She adjusted her cap low over her face, keeping her eyes down, blending in as best she could. In this small town, where strangers stood out, she couldn't afford unnecessary attention. She wheeled herself to the canned goods aisle, quietly going about her task. Her cover as a disabled veteran was usually enough to deter most people's interest, sympathy sometimes, curiosity at worst. But today, the atmosphere changed the moment she heard the heavy boots stomping into the store. "Look who we have here," a voice sneered. Derek Razor Lane, one of the Iron Serpents' regular enforcers, stood at the end of the aisle with a smug grin. His towering frame blocked Sarah's view of the exit. Beside him, Mike Crusher Davis chuckled, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Didn't know you'd still be hanging around town," Razor continued, stepping closer. His tone was mocking, but there was a hint of menace in his voice. "Aren't you supposed to be out somewhere, knitting or whatever it is people like you do?" Sarah didn't respond. She reached for a can of beans, her hand steady despite the growing tension in the room. Ignoring them was the best strategy for now. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Avoid confrontation. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Razor snapped, moving into her path. He nudged one of the cans off the shelf with a deliberate motion, letting it roll across the floor towards Sarah's feet. The clatter echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet store. Sarah exhaled slowly, lowering her gaze. "Just trying to get my shopping done," she said in a calm, even tone. "Is that right?" Crusher smirked and leaned down, picking up the can and tossing it between his hands like a toy. "You know, people in this town don't like outsiders much, especially ones who think they can get away with acting tough." He dropped the can, letting it thud near her wheel. Razor stepped forward and kicked the can again, sending it bouncing against the shelves behind her. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she forced her muscles to stay relaxed. "Come on, Derek. Leave her alone." Mike, the store owner, called from the counter. He didn't sound particularly authoritative, more like someone trying to keep the peace without getting involved. Razor ignored him. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He grinned, leaning over Sarah. His breath was thick with the stench of cheap beer and tobacco. "Or maybe you think you're too good for a little conversation." Sarah could feel her pulse quicken. She kept her expression neutral, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She couldn't afford to break cover now. Not yet. She glanced down at the floor, pretending to search for something. The subtle movement shifted her posture, placing her hand closer to the hidden compartment beneath her seat, a safety measure she rarely needed but always kept within reach. For now, it stayed closed. She wasn't going to escalate the situation unless absolutely necessary. Come on. Crusher. Razor laughed, stepping back. I think our hero here's had enough excitement for today. Before Sarah could react, Crusher reached out and gave the back of her wheelchair a hard shove, causing it to jolt forward. Her groceries spilled from the small basket attached to the frame. A bag of rice burst open, scattering grains across the floor like tiny white pebbles. Oh. No! Razor exclaimed in mock concern. Looks like you had a little accident there. Sarah's fingers twitched, her instincts screaming at her to strike back. She could take both of them down in under 10 seconds, one swift motion to Crusher's knees. A disabling lock on Razor's dominant arm. It would be over before either of them realized what had happened. But that wasn't the mission. Instead, she gritted her teeth and looked away, letting the image of a dusty road in Afghanistan flash through her mind. It had been a different kind of ambush back then. One that left her broken and bleeding while she fought to save others. The scarred memories sharpened her focus, reminding her why she was here now. Control was the key. Always. Mike cleared his throat loudly, stepping out from behind the counter. You boys got what you came for, right? Maybe you should head out now. For a moment, Razor and Crusher stood frozen, their grins fading as they exchanged glances. It was subtle, but Sarah caught the shift. Mike's voice wasn't just casual anymore, there was a hint of warning behind it. Even gang enforcers knew when to back off, especially with too many eyes watching. Fine, Razor muttered. He leaned in close to Sarah one last time. We'll be seeing you around real soon. With that, the two men turned and made their way toward the exit, their boots clomping heavily against the wooden floor. Sarah remained still until she heard the bell above the door jingle again, signaling their departure. Mike approached cautiously, avoiding eye contact. You okay? He asked. Sarah nodded slowly. Yeah. Just another day. She began gathering the spilled groceries, her mind already racing with calculations. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sarah wheeled herself out of Mike's general store, a steely calm masking the simmering anger beneath the surface. The air outside was warm, but the presence of Razor and Crusher lingering near their motorcycles turned the atmosphere icy. They stood near the edge of the sidewalk, watching her like vultures circling prey. She could hear their low, mocking laughter but chose to keep her focus straight ahead. Their arrogance wasn't surprising, men like them thrived on intimidation and fear. What they didn't know was that Sarah Cross wasn't built to scare easily. She navigated her wheelchair with measured control, her mind running through the options. Letting them believe she was vulnerable worked to her advantage. They wouldn't see the real threat until it was too late. Still, their continued attention was a liability she couldn't ignore for much longer. Hey, soldier, Razor called out, stepping onto the sidewalk. He emphasized the word mockingly. What's the rush? We were just getting to know you. Crusher leaned against his bike, smirking as he lit a cigarette. Yeah. Come on. We just want to talk, he added, blowing a cloud of smoke into the air. Sarah paused, keeping her expression neutral. I'm not interested, she said calmly, her voice firm but non-confrontational. She knew pushing back too hard might escalate the situation. And right now, she needed time to assess, plan, and determine just how deep the gang's suspicion had grown. Razor chuckled, shaking his head as he approached her. His boots clattered on the pavement, each step a slow, deliberate act meant to intimidate. See? That's the problem. You think you can just walk, or, I guess, roll around here without anyone noticing. But you're in our town now. And around here, you answer to us. I didn't realize this sidewalk belonged to you, Sarah replied, keeping her gaze steady on him. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrests of her chair, every muscle in her body poised for action if needed. Razor had closed the distance to within a few feet. If he made one wrong move, she was ready. Crusher snorted in amusement from behind Razor. Oh. She's got a mouth on her, he muttered, taking another drag from his cigarette. Think we should teach her a little respect? Razor grinned. Nah, not yet. I think she'll learn fast enough. We're good teachers. Sarah allowed a brief pause, using the silence to gauge the situation. They weren't going to back off without some kind of confrontation. Razor was testing her limits, looking for a reaction. If she stayed passive, they'd push further. If she escalated, it might draw even more unwanted attention. She needed to find a balance. Look, I'm just trying to get through my day, she said evenly. You've made your point. So how about you move on? And we don't have to waste any more time here? Razor's grin faltered slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to maintain such composure. He stepped even closer, his shadow falling across her lap. You've got guts. I'll give you that, he said, his tone shifting to something darker. But guts only get you so far before someone guts you back. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed the handle of Sarah's wheelchair, tilting it slightly backward. It wasn't enough to tip her over, but the sudden imbalance forced her to steady herself quickly. Crusher chuckled, clearly entertained by the display. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her mind calculating every possible move. She could feel her instincts screaming to strike, to disarm Razor and incapacitate him within seconds. But she knew she couldn't afford that, not yet. Instead, she forced her body to relax, allowing her weight to shift naturally as Razor let go of the chair. You really think you're in control here, don't you? She asked quietly, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. Razor hesitated for a split second, something in her tone catching him off guard. But he quickly masked it with a smirk. Yeah, I do, he said, stepping back. And you'll figure that out soon enough. At that moment, the sound of a motorcycle engine rumbled to life behind them. Grant Maddox arrived, pulling his custom black and red bike to a stop near the others. His presence immediately commanded attention. Razor and Crusher straightened slightly, their playful demeanor fading under their leader's gaze. What's going on here? Grant asked, his voice low and authoritative. He removed his helmet and ran a hand through his dark hair, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the scene. Just showing the new girl how things work around here, Razor answered casually. Grant's gaze shifted to Sarah, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hinted at suspicion. He wasn't like the others, he didn't rely solely on brute intimidation. Grant Maddox was calculating, always looking for potential threats and opportunities. You must be the vet everyone's talking about, he said, his tone neutral. Sarah Cross, right? Sarah gave a slight nod. That's right. Grant stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Word travels fast in a town like this. You're new, and new people attract attention. You're not exactly blending in. I'm not looking for attention, Sarah replied. Just trying to live my life. Grant's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. See? That's the problem. Around here. You don't get to live your life without us knowing about it. You've got one day to decide if you're staying or leaving. After that, things might get complicated. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Message received, she said calmly. Grant nodded and gestured for his men to follow him. As the gang mounted their bikes and roared away, Sarah remained still, her mind racing. This wasn't just a case of casual intimidation anymore. The stakes had just risen, and she knew the clock was ticking. Sarah moved steadily down the street after the gang's departure, her wheels gliding smoothly across the cracked sidewalk. The Iron Serpents had made their intentions crystal clear, and Sarah knew their patience wouldn't last. She had 24 hours before they escalated their efforts to drive her out of town, or worse. She couldn't leave, though, not with the mission hanging by a thread. As she approached Abby's café, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and baked goods greeted her. The small bell above the door jingled as she entered, prompting Abby Sanders, the café's owner, to glance up from behind the counter. Abby's eyes softened with concern the moment she saw Sarah's expression. "Rough morning?" Abby asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she moved closer. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun, and the subtle lines around her eyes deepened with worry. "You could say that," Sarah replied, her tone measured. She rolled up to one of the tables near the window, taking a moment to glance outside. The street was quiet for now, but that wouldn't last. The Serpents had eyes everywhere. Abby followed Sarah's gaze and frowned. "Let me guess, Grant Maddox and his crew?" Sarah nodded. "They cornered me at Mike's store. Razor and Crusher thought it'd be fun to play games. Maddox showed up later to make it official. I have one day to get out of town." Abby cursed under her breath. "They really don't let up, do they? I swear. This town's been on edge ever since those thugs rolled in. They think they own the place." "They do. In a way," Sarah said quietly. "At least until someone stops them." Abby leaned on the table, lowering her voice. "You're not thinking of confronting them, are you? I know you've got your training and all, but these guys play dirty. They've got connections that go higher than just this town." "I'm not planning to pick a fight," Sarah assured her. "But I can't back down either. If I leave now, they'll only tighten their grip on everyone else. Besides, I'm here for a reason." Abby gave her a long look before nodding. She didn't know all the details of Sarah's mission, but she trusted her enough to know there was more at stake than what appeared on the surface. "You're walking, or rolling, a fine line. You know that, right?" Abby said, glancing toward the door. "They won't take kindly to someone standing in their way." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But I've dealt with worse." The two women fell into a brief silence, each lost in thought. Outside, the wind stirred the dust on the street, creating small whirlwinds near the sidewalk. The town had a worn, tired look to it, like a place that had seen better days but was now caught in a slow decline. Sarah wondered how many people had already given up hope of change. Breaking the silence, Abby spoke again. "Chief Anderson stopped by earlier. He's been keeping tabs on the Serpents too. He's not happy with how things are escalating, but I get the feeling his hands are tied." Sarah considered that information. Chief Anderson had been a neutral presence so far, neither actively helping nor hindering her mission. If he was aware of the Serpent's growing power, he might become an ally. Still, trusting anyone in a situation like this was risky, especially with corruption running deep in places like Silver Creek. "I'll reach out to him soon," Sarah said. Maybe he can help keep the pressure off. At least for a little while. Abby nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. Just be careful. Okay? You've got enough enemies already. Don't need the cops turning on you too. I'll keep that in mind. Sarah promised. The conversation shifted to safer topics for the next few minutes. Abby brought Sarah a coffee and a sandwich, insisting she needed to keep her strength up. Despite the calming atmosphere of the cafe, Sarah's mind remained focused on the threat looming over her. After finishing her meal, she glanced at the time. The day was slipping away faster than she would have liked. She needed to start preparing for the next steps, contacting her FBI liaison, Nathan Cooper, and securing her surveillance setup. Every move from this point on had to be calculated. One mistake could blow her cover and jeopardize the entire operation. As Sarah wheeled toward the door, Abby called out after her. Hey, Sarah? She turned back, raising an eyebrow. Yeah? You've got people here who care. Abby said softly. You're not alone in this. A faint smile tugged at Sarah's lips. Thanks, Abby. I'll remember that. With that, she pushed open the door and rolled out into the afternoon sun. The street was still quiet, but Sarah knew it wouldn't stay that way. The Iron Serpents weren't the type to sit back and wait. They'd come for her soon. And when they did, she had to be ready. As she made her way toward her small house on the outskirts of town, Sarah mentally reviewed her plans. Surveillance routes, communication points, contingency options, it all needed to be airtight. The Serpents thought they had her cornered, but they didn't know the full extent of what she was capable of. Not yet. One day. That was all the time she had to turn the tide in her favor. The clock was ticking, and Sarah Cross wasn't about to waste a single second. The hum of the coffee grinder filled the air as Sarah entered Abby's cafe. The morning crowd had mostly thinned out, leaving a few regulars scattered around the tables. Abby was behind the counter, serving the last of the breakfast orders. She caught sight of Sarah and waved her over. Sarah, you're here early, Abby said as she wiped her hands on a towel. I've got that corner table open for you. Sarah nodded in appreciation and moved to her usual spot by the window. She liked this position, it gave her a clear view of the street outside while also keeping her back to a solid wall. Abby quickly joined her, placing a fresh cup of coffee on the table. Thanks, Sarah said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Abby sat across from her, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. Her expression was serious. We need to talk. Things are heating up with the Serpents. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? They've been making moves, pushing harder on local businesses, Abby explained. Grant Maddox has been visiting some of the shop owners in person. He's not just demanding protection money anymore. There are rumors he's threatening people to keep quiet about certain shipments. Shipments? Sarah echoed, her voice low. Abby nodded. Word is, they've got something big coming in soon. Weapons. Maybe. People are scared. Sarah. They think Maddox and his gang have connections in places we don't even know about, maybe even with law enforcement. Nobody's talking openly, but I've overheard enough to piece some of it together. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, letting the information settle. The gang's control was spreading faster than she had anticipated. If they were planning a major weapons delivery, it explained the increase in intimidation tactics. Still, the idea that they might have influence over local authorities was troubling. Do you think Chief Anderson is involved? Sarah asked after a moment. Abby hesitated. I'm not sure. He's been acting a bit distant lately. I don't think he's on their payroll. But it's like he's avoiding conflict with them. Either he's scared or he's under pressure from someone higher up. Sarah frowned. She had been hoping Anderson might become an ally. But if he was compromised, or even just unwilling to take a stand, that could complicate things further. The gang's power structure was becoming harder to map. And she needed to tread carefully. As they spoke, the door to the cafe opened. And a low murmur of conversation followed. Sarah glanced up instinctively. Her grip on the mug tightened when she saw who had just entered. Grant Maddox strode inside, flanked by Razor and another gang member Sarah didn't recognize. He was dressed casually, but there was a calculated confidence in his posture. His eyes scanned the room, quickly locking onto Sarah's table. He smiled, though the expression carried no warmth. "Morning, ladies," Maddox greeted as he made his way toward them. Abby stiffened slightly but kept her composure. "Maddox," Sarah said evenly, her eyes never leaving his. "What brings you here today?" "Oh, you know. Just checking in on the fine folks of Silver Creek," Maddox replied, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Razor and the other gang member lingered nearby, their presence an unspoken reminder of the threat they posed. "Busy morning?" Maddox continued, his tone casual but with an edge of menace. "Just having a conversation," Sarah replied, keeping her tone neutral. "What do you want?" Maddox chuckled softly. "Straight to the point. I like that. Well, I thought I'd come by to remind you of something important. You see, in this town, there are rules. Rules that people like me make sure everyone follows." "And what rules would those be?" Sarah asked, leaning back slightly in her chair. She refused to show any sign of intimidation, though she was acutely aware of the tension in the room. "Rule number 1, Maddox said, leaning in closer. "You don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Especially when it comes to business matters. We've got things running smoothly here. And we don't need outsiders like you messing that up." "I'm not here to mess with anything," Sarah replied calmly. "I just want to live my life in peace." Maddox smiled again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "See, that's the thing. Peace doesn't come cheap around here. And it's not something you get to decide on your own. We decide who gets to live peacefully." Sarah held his gaze, her mind racing through potential responses. Maddox was testing her, probing for weaknesses. If she pushed too hard, he might escalate. But if she appeared too passive, he would continue to press. "Sounds like a lot of responsibility," Sarah said carefully. "Must be exhausting. Keeping control over everyone." Maddox's smile widened, though there was no humor in it. "It has its challenges. Sure. But I've got a good team to handle things. People who understand loyalty." There it was, a subtle warning. Maddox wasn't just talking about his gang. He was hinting at allies within the town's infrastructure. Sarah could feel Abby shifting uncomfortably beside her, picking up on the same implication. "Well," Sarah said after a pause, "I hope you're not overworking yourselves. Stress can be dangerous." Maddox chuckled, standing from the table. "I'll keep that in mind. But just remember, this town has a way of dealing with stress. And people who don't belong tend to find themselves unwelcome." He gave her a final look before turning to leave. Razor and the other gang member followed, the cafe falling into an uneasy silence as the door swung shut behind them. Abby exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "That man is a snake," she muttered. "Yeah," Sarah agreed quietly. "And he's tightening his grip." They both knew the encounter was a warning. Maddox was asserting dominance, letting Sarah know he was aware of her presence and didn't trust her. The message was clear: she was being watched. And any misstep could bring retaliation. "We need to be careful," Abby said, lowering her voice. "If what I've heard is true, Maddox has people in places that can make things very difficult for you." "I know," Sarah replied, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. She couldn't afford to let fear cloud her judgment. Every move had to be calculated, every decision precise. The stakes were rising, and the web of danger around her was growing tighter. Maddox wasn't just a gang leader, he was part of something much larger. Sarah needed answers. And fast. Abby sat back in her chair, glancing nervously at the door of the café. The encounter with Maddox had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "Sarah, this is getting out of hand. He didn't come here just to chat." That was a warning. "I know," Sarah replied calmly. Her eyes were distant, already analyzing the situation. "He's testing the waters, seeing if I'll break. He's trying to gauge whether I'm a threat. Well, he's not going to stop," Abby said, lowering her voice. "The Serpents aren't like the other gangs that come through town. They've got a system in place. And Maddox plays the long game. He won't let anyone undermine his authority." Sarah took another sip of her coffee, considering Abby's words. She knew Maddox was dangerous, but what concerned her more were his connections. The way he had hinted at controlling more than just the gang members suggested influence in places that could compromise her mission. She couldn't shake the feeling that Maddox's reach extended further than she had anticipated. "I'll be careful," Sarah assured her. "But I need to gather more intel. The fact that he came here himself means they're worried. They wouldn't bother with threats if they didn't think I was a problem." Abby sighed, shaking her head. "I still don't like this. You're putting yourself at risk. And for what? No one else is standing up to them." "I'm not here to stand up to them," Sarah replied. "I'm here to dismantle their operations. There's a weapons shipment coming, and Maddox's gang is in the middle of it. If I can track it, I can shut it down before it spreads." Abby frowned. "And you think Maddox doesn't already suspect you? He's got people everywhere. You have to assume they're watching your every move." Sarah nodded. "That's why I'm keeping my routine low-key. The last thing I want is to draw more attention than I already have." Before Abby could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced around the cafe to make sure no one was watching before discreetly pulling out the device. The screen displayed a coded message from her FBI contact, Nathan Cooper. The text was simple but carried a weight of urgency. "Secure channel compromised. Possible leak. Proceed with caution." Sarah's jaw tightened as she read the message. A leak within the agency was the last thing she needed. If someone inside the FBI was feeding information to the Serpents or their associates, her entire mission could be at risk. It also explained Maddox's heightened awareness. He might already have access to classified intelligence, giving him an advantage Sarah hadn't accounted for. "What's wrong?" Abby asked, noticing the shift in Sarah's expression. "Just a reminder to stay on guard," Sarah replied, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She didn't want to burden Abby with the details of internal corruption. The fewer people who knew, the safer they would be. But the implications of the message were hard to ignore. If Cooper was right and the secure channel had been breached, Sarah's communications were no longer reliable. Every piece of information she transmitted or received could be monitored. She needed to find a way to operate independently, relying on trusted contacts rather than official channels. Sarah leaned closer to Abby. "I need you to keep your ear to the ground. If you hear anything about new shipments or strange activity, let me know right away." But be discreet. Maddox has eyes everywhere. Abby nodded reluctantly. You know I've got your back. Just promise me you'll be careful. I don't want to see you get hurt. I promise, Sarah said, her tone softer this time. We're in this together. But I'll do everything I can to keep the heat off you. They sat in silence for a moment, both women contemplating the precarious situation. Outside, a couple of townspeople passed by the café, their conversations muted and hurried. It was as if the whole town had learned to walk on eggshells, fearful of attracting the wrong kind of attention. Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios. If Maddox's gang was connected to someone within law enforcement or even the FBI, she needed to reevaluate her strategy. Trust would be a rare commodity from now on. She would have to rely on her instincts and her experience to navigate the minefield ahead. Eventually, Sarah stood, her movements deliberate and calm. I need to head back. There are a few things I need to take care of before tonight. Abby looked up at her, concern still etched across her face. You'll call if you need anything, right? Of course, Sarah replied with a small smile. You've been a huge help already. Just stay safe. Abby watched as Sarah rolled toward the door, her eyes lingering on the hardened determination in her friend's posture. As the door closed behind Sarah, Abby muttered under her breath, You too. Outside, Sarah paused for a moment to take in her surroundings. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The Iron Serpents might be watching her, but that didn't mean she couldn't watch them in return. She had a plan to formulate and a mission to complete. With the message from Cooper still fresh in her mind, Sarah made her way toward her house on the outskirts of town. The stakes had just risen, and the web of danger around her was tightening. She needed to stay 2 steps ahead, or she'd risk losing control of the operation entirely. The game had changed, and now it was a race to see who would outmaneuver whom. Sarah rolled into her small, secure operations room at the back of the house. It was unassuming from the outside, blending in with the rest of the modest property. But behind the false wall, she had everything she needed to monitor and plan her mission. Surveillance monitors flickered to life as she activated the system, displaying various camera angles around Silver Creek, including the Iron Serpents compound on the outskirts of town. She adjusted the camera feed, zooming in on the compound's entrance. Razor and Crusher were visible near the front gate, laughing and sharing a smoke while other gang members worked in the background. Several crates were being unloaded from a truck, their contents obscured by tarps. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene, noting the increased security presence. Something was coming, likely the weapons shipment Abby had mentioned. Sarah clicked through more photos taken over the past few days. She studied the layout carefully, marking key areas, 2 entrances, both heavily guarded, a large warehouse near the center, and a smaller side building that appeared to be an office. From her observations, the office likely housed Maddox when he was overseeing operations. There were minimal blind spots, meaning any approach would require precision and timing. Her fingers tapped lightly on the desk as she mentally mapped out a strategy. She would need to create a distraction, something to draw most of the guards away from the key targets. Perhaps a staged disturbance near the perimeter or a false fire alarm. It wasn't a perfect plan yet, but it was a start. As she continued analyzing, her mind wandered back to Afghanistan. The memory came unbidden, vivid and unrelenting. The desert heat, the suffocating weight of her gear, and the eerie silence before the explosion all came rushing back. It had been a routine patrol, or at least that's what they'd been told. Their mission was to secure a village suspected of harboring insurgents. Sarah had led her team through narrow, winding paths, scanning for any signs of danger. She remembered the children, frightened but curious, peeking out from behind mud brick walls. It was a brief moment of calm before the chaos. The improvised explosive device, IED, had been buried just beneath the surface of the road. She never saw it. Never had a chance to react. The blast tore through the convoy, flipping vehicles and sending shrapnel in every direction. Sarah's legs were gone before she even realized what had happened. But even in the midst of the carnage, she had refused to succumb to panic. With adrenaline surging through her system, she had taken command, directing her remaining team members to evacuate the injured. It was in those moments of crisis that she had learned the value of adaptability and quick thinking, skills that had kept her alive then and continued to serve her now. She shook off the memory, forcing herself to refocus on the task at hand. This wasn't Afghanistan, but the stakes were just as high. The Iron Serpents weren't amateurs. They were organized, well-connected, and likely armed with military-grade equipment. Underestimating them would be a fatal mistake. Sarah switched to another camera angle, this time capturing activity near the rear of the compound. A group of men was moving additional crates into the warehouse. She zoomed in, attempting to get a clearer view. The faces were unfamiliar, likely hired muscle or new recruits. It wasn't unusual for gangs like the Serpents to bring in outsiders for high-risk operations. She jotted down notes on a notepad beside her, listing possible entry points, guard rotations, and potential choke points. Her tactical training was second nature by now, each detail adding to the larger picture of how she might execute a raid when the time came. As she studied the compound, her thoughts drifted to the larger implications of the operation. The shipment wasn't just about local dominance. If the Serpents were trafficking weapons on a large scale, it meant they had ties to bigger players, cartels, corrupt officials, maybe even international arms dealers. The corruption could extend far beyond Silver Creek, and Sarah needed to stay ahead of it. The surveillance feed flickered momentarily, pulling her from her thoughts. She adjusted the system, ensuring the signal was stable. Every piece of intelligence was critical, and she couldn't afford technical glitches. The cameras were positioned well enough to avoid suspicion, but she knew she had to remain vigilant. Maddox and his gang wouldn't hesitate to tear apart the town looking for anyone who crossed them. Taking a deep breath, Sarah leaned back in her chair and let her eyes drift to the ceiling. The weight of the mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had seen this type of criminal network before, how it preyed on fear and silence to maintain control. It was the same pattern she had encountered in war zones, only disguised under a different banner. But she wasn't alone this time. Abby's support, though unofficial, was invaluable. Still, Sarah knew she couldn't rely too heavily on anyone. Trust was a fragile commodity in a town where alliances shifted with the tide of power. She had to be careful, methodical, and always 2 steps ahead. A notification blinked on the monitor, indicating that a new set of images had been uploaded from one of her remote cameras. Sarah clicked on the file and began reviewing the latest shots. The images confirmed her suspicions. More vehicles were arriving at the compound, each one carrying cargo that was carefully concealed. The operation was escalating. Time to step up the game, Sarah muttered under her breath. She made a mental note to contact Nathan Cooper later. Despite the warning about a possible leak within the agency, she needed updated intel on any recent arms deals that might match the Serpents' activities. If there was a larger network at play, she had to know who was pulling the strings. For now, all she could do was prepare. The pieces were moving into place, and the clock was ticking. Whatever the Serpents were planning, Sarah was determined to stay one step ahead. Sarah was deep in thought, reviewing her tactical notes, when a knock at the door pulled her out of her focus. She wheeled herself toward the front entrance, opening it to find Abby standing there, her expression tense. "We need to talk," Abby said without preamble. Stepping inside, Sarah closed the door behind her. "What's going on?" Abby crossed her arms, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to be watching. "People in town have been talking. I heard something today that we need to take seriously. It's about Chief Anderson." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What about him?" Abby sighed, lowering her voice. "Several people saw him meeting privately with Maddox. Not just a passing conversation either. Apparently, they were talking for a long time behind the hardware store where no one could overhear them. It's got folks wondering if Anderson is in Maddox's pocket." Sarah clenched her jaw. This wasn't entirely unexpected, but it was still troubling. Anderson had maintained a hands-off approach with the gang, which could have been attributed to caution or fear. But if he was actively engaging with Maddox, it raised serious concerns about his loyalty. "Did anyone hear what they were talking about?" Sarah asked. "No," Abby replied, shaking her head. "But the timing is suspicious. Ever since you showed up, the Serpents have been more active. If Anderson's taking orders from Maddox, they might already be planning something." Sarah took a deep breath, processing the information. Trust had always been a delicate issue in operations like this. She had hoped that Anderson might serve as a neutral party or even an ally. But now that possibility seemed increasingly unlikely. If he was compromised, Sarah would have to adjust her strategy to account for potential interference from law enforcement. "Do you think he's fully in with them?" Sarah asked. Abby hesitated. "I don't know. Anderson's always been hard to read. He doesn't seem like the type to get his hands dirty. But who knows? Maybe Maddox has leverage on him." "Leverage or money?" Sarah muttered. "Either way, it complicates things." Abby nodded. "Exactly. You'll have to be careful. If Anderson's working with Maddox, anything you do could get reported back to the gang. They'd know your moves before you make them." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her mind racing with possibilities. A compromised police chief meant fewer safe options for backup or support. She would need to limit her communications and focus on covert tactics. Misdirection would become essential, keeping the Serpents chasing shadows while she worked in the background. "I'll handle it," Sarah said firmly. "But you need to stay under the radar too. If Maddox gets wind that you're feeding me information, you'll be a target." "Don't worry about me," Abby replied, though her voice was tinged with worry. "I've dealt with worse. Just promise me you'll watch your back." "I will," Sarah assured her. "We're in this together. But I'll keep you out of the line of fire as much as I can." Abby gave a faint smile, though the tension in her posture didn't ease. "You've always got a plan, don't you?" Sarah shrugged slightly. "Plans change. But I've learned to stay flexible." That much was true. Her time in Afghanistan had taught her the importance of adapting to constantly shifting circumstances. Nothing ever went exactly according to plan in the field. The key was to anticipate obstacles and be ready to pivot when necessary. The two women sat in silence for a moment before Abby spoke again. "There's something else that's been bothering me." "What is it?" "Someone's been asking around about you," Abby said quietly. "A guy I didn't recognize. He's not local. And he didn't look like one of Maddox's regulars. He was asking questions, trying to be subtle. But I could tell he was fishing for information." Sarah's instinct sharpened. An outsider asking questions was a red flag. It could mean that someone outside the Serpents network was keeping tabs on her. Whether it was another gang, a third-party contractor, or even someone tied to the agency leak Nathan Cooper had warned her about. It was a development she couldn't ignore. "Did you get a good look at him?" Sarah asked. Abby nodded. "Tall. Early 40s. Clean cut. Military posture. If I had to guess. Definitely not someone who blends in around here." Military. Sarah's mind immediately went to the possibility of a rogue operative or mercenary. The arms trade often attracted ex-military personnel, especially those willing to sell their skills to the highest bidder. If this man was connected to the Serpent suppliers, it might explain his interest in her presence. "I'll keep an eye out," Sarah said. "If you see him again, let me know. But don't engage him. He's probably dangerous." "Got it." Abby agreed. Sarah stood and walked with Abby to the door. The warning signs were everywhere now. Between Anderson's potential compromise, Maddox's increased activity, and this new outsider, the situation was becoming more volatile by the hour. She had to assume that every move she made was being monitored, either directly or through informants. "Stay safe, Abby," Sarah said as her friend stepped outside. "You too," Abby replied. "Don't let them catch you off guard." With that, Abby headed down the street, disappearing into the evening shadows. Sarah watched her go for a moment before closing the door and locking it behind her. She rolled back to her operations room and stared at the monitors, her mind already recalibrating her plans. Every piece of information added to the puzzle, but it also made the picture more complex. The web of danger around her was tightening, and Sarah knew she had little room for error. Trust was a rare commodity now, and even those she had once considered potential allies were becoming question marks. As she resumed her surveillance, Sarah's thoughts sharpened with a single objective: stay ahead of the game. The Serpents and their allies might think they had the upper hand, but she had no intention of letting them dictate the terms. It was time to go on the offensive. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. Sarah moved swiftly, checking each room of her house one final time to ensure everything was in place. It had to look convincing, like someone packing up and leaving in a hurry. Abby stood nearby, folding the last few items of clothing and placing them in a cardboard box marked with fragile and bold letters. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Abby asked, taping the box shut. Her voice carried a note of apprehension. "It has to," Sarah replied, her tone steady. "Maddox thinks he's got me cornered. If he believes I've given up and left town, he'll relax. We need him distracted so I can operate without him breathing down my neck." Abby sighed and wiped her hands on her jeans. "I don't like this. They're going to be watching every move we make." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Sarah said, rolling toward her equipment table. She retrieved a small GPS tracker from a drawer. "This is the key. I'll plant it in your truck, and they'll follow you instead of me." Abby raised an eyebrow. "And you're sure they won't catch on?" Sarah shook her head. "Maddox and his crew are overconfident. They think intimidation is enough to keep people in line. They won't expect me to pull a stunt like this." Abby nodded, though her unease remained. "All right. Let's get this over with." Together, they loaded the boxes into Abby's truck. Sarah made sure to place the GPS tracker under the driver's seat, hidden from view but emitting a strong enough signal for anyone using a locator device. Once everything was secured, Sarah gave the truck a quick inspection, ensuring it looked like a legitimate departure. "We'll head out toward the old county road," Sarah explained. "That's where they'll expect me to leave. Once we're far enough from town, I'll hop out, and you'll keep driving. Make it look like you're heading for the state border." "And you?" Abby asked, concern flickering in her eyes. "I'll be doubling back to the safe house I set up outside the North Ridge," Sarah replied. "From there, I can monitor their movements without being detected." Abby took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay. Let's do this." They both climbed into the truck, Abby in the driver's seat, Sarah in the passenger side. The vehicle rumbled to life, and Abby slowly pulled out onto the main road. Sarah kept her eyes on the mirrors, scanning for any signs of the Iron Serpents. It didn't take long for their shadows to appear. "There," Sarah murmured, spotting a pair of motorcycles trailing several blocks behind them. Razor and another gang member had taken the bait, their silhouettes unmistakable against the fading afternoon light. "They're following," Abby whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Good. Just keep driving. Don't speed up or slow down. We want them to think this is routine," Sarah instructed. They drove through town at a steady pace, passing familiar landmarks. Several townspeople glanced at the truck, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and relief. News of Sarah's departure would likely spread quickly. For most of them, the idea of someone standing up to the Iron Serpents probably seemed foolish, and her apparent retreat would reinforce their fears of the gang's dominance. As they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Sarah signaled for Abby to pull over near an abandoned rest stop. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The area was quiet, the perfect spot for a discreet exit. "This is where I get out," Sarah said, opening the door. "Keep heading south. Take the truck onto the old highway and drive for about an hour before turning around. Make it look like you're really leaving town." "Got it," Abby replied, her voice strained. "Be careful, Sarah." "I will. And remember, don't stop for anything. If they follow you, just stick to the plan," Sarah reassured her. Abby nodded and watched as Sarah wheeled herself out of the truck and onto the gravel shoulder. Without wasting any time, Sarah moved toward the tree line, disappearing into the growing shadows. Abby took a deep breath, shifted the truck into gear, and continued down the road. Sarah waited in silence, listening for the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. It wasn't long before she heard them, Razor and his companion accelerating to keep up with Abby's truck. They wouldn't see her slip away, they were too focused on their target. Once the sound faded, Sarah activated a hidden earpiece connected to her surveillance system. "Trackers in motion. They're on it," she whispered to herself. The decoy was working exactly as planned. She navigated through the woods, making her way toward a narrow trail that led to her backup operations base. It was a small, well-hidden cabin she had outfitted with basic surveillance equipment and supplies. From there, she would maintain visual and digital tracking on the Serpents without risking exposure. Reaching the cabin, Sarah entered quietly and secured the door behind her. She powered up the equipment, watching as the GPS tracker's signal moved steadily along the highway. Abby was doing her part, and the Serpents were taking the bait. Everything was falling into place. Sarah exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. The most dangerous part of the plan was over. Now came the waiting game, watching, listening, and staying one step ahead of Maddox and his crew. The trap was set, and Sarah intended to use every advantage she had to see it through. Grant Maddox leaned against his motorcycle at a discreet vantage point near the old county road, watching Abby's truck move steadily down the highway. Razor stood next to him, a smug grin on his face as he tapped a cigarette against his palm. "She's running scared. Just like you said," Razor muttered, lighting the cigarette and taking a deep drag. "Didn't even put up a fight." Maddox's eyes narrowed as he observed the truck. The sight of the vehicle piled high with boxes and belongings seemed to confirm what he already believed. Sarah Cross had gotten the message loud and clear. Silver Creek wasn't a place for outsiders who didn't play by his rules. "Yeah," Maddox said quietly. "She's smarter than she looks. Knows when she's beat." "You want us to follow her all the way to the state line?" Razor asked, glancing sideways at him. "Not all the way," Maddox replied. "Just make sure she doesn't double back. I don't trust her to go quietly. People like that always have tricks up their sleeve." He pushed off the bike and waved to one of the other gang members stationed nearby. "Keep a safe distance. We don't want her knowing we're tailing her." The man nodded and mounted his own bike. Razor chuckled as he flicked his cigarette to the ground. "Man, she really thought she could stick around and mess with us. Guess she learned her lesson." Maddox didn't respond immediately. Something about the situation still nagged at him. Sarah had shown more composure than most when he'd confronted her at the café. People like that didn't scare easily. He had expected some kind of pushback. But instead, she was quietly leaving. It seemed almost too easy. "You think she's really gone for good?" Razor asked after a moment. Maddox crossed his arms, his gaze still locked on the fading silhouette of the truck. "We'll see. I'm not taking any chances. Keep tabs on her for now. If anything feels off, let me know." "Got it," Razor said, pulling on his helmet and straddling his bike. Within moments, he and the other rider sped off down the road, following the truck at a careful distance. Maddox stayed behind, his mind churning with possibilities. If Sarah was trying to deceive him, it wouldn't take long to find out. He had men positioned at key points along the highway and in town. If she attempted to slip back in, someone would spot her. But if she really was leaving, then the Serpents could refocus on their operations without further distractions. Satisfied for the moment, Maddox turned and made his way back to his own bike. The sound of the engine roared to life as he sped off toward the compound. They had other business to handle, shipments to secure, deals to finalize. Sarah Cross would either stay gone or make a mistake that would cost her dearly. Underscore 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 underscore. Meanwhile, Sarah monitored the scene from her hidden operations base. The surveillance feed showed Razor and his companion following Abby's truck at a steady pace. The GPS signal remained strong, moving south along the highway as planned. "They're taking the bait," Sarah muttered under her breath. She adjusted the camera angles to keep track of any other gang members who might be stationed near the compound. So far, everything was proceeding as expected. Abby's voice came through on Sarah's earpiece. "Still on me. They're keeping their distance, but I can see them in my mirrors." "Good. Stick to the route. They won't follow you forever," Sarah replied. "Once you hit the old crossroads, loop back around and head toward your place. By the time they realize you're not going all the way to the border, it'll be too late." "Got it," Abby answered, though there was a hint of tension in her voice. "Let's hope they don't get suspicious." "They won't. They think they've already won," Sarah assured her. "Just drive steady and keep up appearances." As the communication ended, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the monitors for any signs of unusual activity. She knew this was only the beginning. The Serpents might be overconfident now, but Maddox wasn't a fool. Eventually, he would realize something was wrong. When that moment came, Sarah had to be ready to strike first. The trap was in motion. and Sarah intended to use every second of their distraction to her advantage. The dense canopy of trees surrounding the abandoned lumber mill provided ample cover for Sarah as she made her way to a vantage point overlooking the main yard. The mill had long since fallen into disrepair, its rusted equipment and crumbling structures casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. From her concealed position, she had a clear view of the compound's layout, a wide-open loading area, several storage buildings, and a central warehouse that appeared to be the main hub of activity. The low rumble of engines echoed through the still night air. Sarah adjusted her binoculars and spotted a convoy of trucks approaching the compound from the north entrance. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop at the gate, where two Iron Serpents guards exchanged quick words with the driver before waving the trucks inside. The convoy pulled into the loading area, and the gang members quickly began unloading large crates. Sarah zoomed in, studying the operation. The crates were heavy, requiring 2 or 3 men to carry each one. Their size and the way the Serpents handled them suggested they were filled with weapons or ammunition. She made mental notes of the vehicle's license plates and the number of guards stationed around the area. Multiple entry points, minimal lighting near the eastern perimeter, she muttered under her breath. She tapped a button on her wrist device, recording key details for later review. Movement near the main warehouse drew her attention. A tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the building, flanked by 2 armed bodyguards. His commanding presence and the way the others deferred to him confirmed his identity: Robert Silas. Sarah recognized him immediately from the briefing files, former colonel, dishonorably discharged after an arms smuggling scandal. He was now deeply embedded in the criminal underworld, serving as a key supplier for groups like the Iron Serpents. Silas, Sarah whispered, her eyes narrowing. His presence elevated the operation's importance. This wasn't just a routine delivery, it was likely a high-level transaction involving multiple parties. Silas gestured toward one of the trucks, and a heated discussion began between him and Grant Maddox, who had arrived moments earlier. Sarah couldn't hear the exact words, but the tension was evident in their body language. Maddox appeared agitated, his hands moving in sharp, aggressive motions. Silas, by contrast, remained calm, his posture exuding authority. Sarah shifted her position, keeping low to avoid detection. She needed to gather more intelligence before making a move. If tensions between Maddox and Silas escalated, it could create an opportunity for her to disrupt the operation without direct confrontation. A sudden flash of headlights signaled the arrival of another group. 2 black SUVs rolled into the compound, their tinted windows concealing the occupants. The vehicles parked near the warehouse, and several men in tactical gear stepped out. They weren't Iron Serpents, Sarah could tell from their disciplined movements and high-end equipment. Mercenaries, she guessed, likely hired muscle for one of the rival buyer groups. The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Sarah scanned the area, noting the positions of key personnel and choke points. The presence of multiple factions increased the risk of a firefight breaking out, but it also gave her an advantage. If tensions boiled over, she could use the chaos to achieve her objective. She reached into her gear pack and retrieved a small drone, activating it with a quiet hum. The drone hovered silently as Sarah guided it toward the eastern side of the compound, using the shadows to keep it hidden. Its onboard camera transmitted real-time footage to her wrist device, giving her a better view of the interior layout. The drone captured images of crates being stacked inside the warehouse, along with several men unloading additional supplies. Sarah took note of a secondary entrance at the rear of the building, which was only lightly guarded. It could serve as a potential infiltration point if she needed to move in quickly. Secondary entrance. Minimal coverage, she recorded into her device. Interior warehouse layout partially obstructed, possible storage rooms on the east wing. She brought the drone back to her position, landing it softly beside her. The more she observed, the clearer it became that this operation was a pivotal moment for the Iron Serpents. If she could disrupt the deal and capture Silas, it would deal a significant blow to both the gang and their network of suppliers. A rustling noise nearby made Sarah freeze. She quickly scanned her surroundings but saw nothing out of place. Still, her instincts remained on high alert. In operations like this, the smallest oversight could be fatal. She adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she had cover in case of an ambush. Her earpiece buzzed softly, and she tapped it to activate the secure channel. It was Abby, checking in from her location outside the mill's perimeter. "Everything good on your end?" Abby's voice was calm but tinged with concern. "Good so far," Sarah replied quietly. "They've got multiple factions here. Silas is running the show, and Maddox doesn't look happy about it. Looks like rival buyers are on site too." "Think it's going to blow up?" Abby asked. "Possibly. I'm counting on it," Sarah said. "I'll keep monitoring for now. Stay on standby." "Roger that. Be careful," Abby said before the line went silent again. Sarah exhaled slowly, refocusing on the task at hand. The pieces were in place, and the situation was volatile. All she needed was the right moment to strike. Silas's arrogance and Maddox's temper were liabilities she could exploit. If they clashed, it would create the perfect opening for her to move in. For now, she would wait, watch, and let the tension build. The night was far from over, and Sarah knew that before dawn. Everything would change. Sarah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the central area of the lumber mill compound. The tension between Grant Maddox and Robert Silas continued to escalate as more trucks arrived, their engines idling ominously. Silas seemed composed, his hands calmly resting at his sides, while Maddox's frustration boiled over in sharp, aggressive gestures. "I told you we needed this shipment here last week." Maddox's voice finally echoed across the compound, his anger no longer contained. Though Sarah couldn't hear Silas's response clearly, the colonel's body language was deliberate and controlled, exuding a quiet authority that only fueled Maddox's irritation. Nearby, Razor and several other serpents exchanged uneasy glances. The rival buyers from the SUVs stood at a distance, observing the argument with thinly veiled hostility. One of their leaders, a man with a scar running down the side of his face, crossed his arms and leaned toward one of his associates. The tension in the compound was palpable, the air charged with the possibility of violence. Sarah adjusted her binoculars and refocused on key individuals. Maddox was impulsive and prone to emotional outbursts, a weakness that could push him into making rash decisions. Silas, on the other hand, was calculating. He likely had backup plans in place should things spiral out of control. The mercenaries guarding the rival buyers added another unpredictable element to the equation. A sudden shift in the atmosphere drew Sarah's attention back to the buyers. The scar-faced man stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night. "We didn't come here to watch you two argue," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If there's going to be a problem with the shipment, we'll take our business elsewhere." Maddox turned sharply toward him. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. "The deal's still on. You'll get your weapons." "Then maybe you should start acting like it," the buyer retorted, his tone icy. Silas intervened before things could escalate further. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "The shipment is here. Let's complete the transaction and move on." The buyer hesitated for a moment before giving a slight nod. Maddox, however, continued to bristle, his pride clearly wounded. Sarah could see that he was barely holding himself together. If someone pushed him just a little further, he would snap. Deciding to take advantage of the building tension, Sarah activated the drone she had positioned earlier near the warehouse. From her hidden vantage point, she guided it silently toward the storage area, using its camera to get a closer look at the weapons being unloaded. The crates were open one by one, revealing an assortment of rifles, ammunition, and explosives. It was a significant cache, more than enough to arm several gangs or militias. Sarah made a quick recording, storing the footage for evidence. The situation was volatile, and it was only a matter of time before someone made a mistake that set everything off. She didn't have to wait long. One of the rival buyers gestured to a crate of rifles and asked something Sarah couldn't hear. Razor, standing nearby, responded with a dismissive sneer, waving him off. The buyer's associate stepped forward, his body tense. "We're not paying for half-stocked crates," he said loudly. "You think you can cheat us? Watch your mouth." Razor shot back, stepping closer. "You're lucky we're even dealing with you." The buyer's associate reached for his weapon, and in an instant, the entire scene exploded into chaos. Razor drew his pistol, and a shot rang out, cutting through the night. The sound reverberated through the compound, triggering a cascade of gunfire as both sides scrambled for cover. Sarah ducked instinctively, though she remained safely hidden in the shadows. Smoke and muzzle flashes lit up the compound as bullets tore through crates and equipment. Maddox shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire. Silas and his guards retreated toward the warehouse, their weapons drawn but unused for the moment. The rival buyers were pinned down near their SUVs, returning fire with precision. Sarah moved quickly, seizing the opportunity created by the chaos. She launched several smoke canisters from her position, aiming them strategically to obscure key areas of the compound. Thick clouds of smoke billowed outward, disorienting the combatants and breaking their lines of sight. Through the cover of smoke, Sarah advanced toward the warehouse, her movements swift and silent. She disabled 2 gang members guarding the rear entrance, striking with precise blows that rendered them unconscious before they could raise an alarm. With the path clear, she slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, shadows stretching across rows of stacked crates. Sarah paused, listening for any signs of movement. Footsteps echoed faintly from the far side of the building. She followed the sound, moving cautiously between the stacks of crates. Near the center of the warehouse, she found Silas and 2 of his guards. They were discussing their next move, their voices low but urgent. "Get the remaining crates loaded," Silas ordered. "We're leaving now. This deal is compromised." One of the guards hesitated. "What about Maddox?" Silas shook his head. "He's on his own. We're not risking the shipment for his temper." Sarah saw her opening, moving swiftly. She deployed a stun grenade, tossing it into their midst. The device detonated with a blinding flash and deafening bang, disorienting Silas and his men. Before they could recover, Sarah was on them. She incapacitated the guards with a series of quick strikes, leaving them sprawled on the ground. Silas, still dazed, stumbled backward. Sarah leveled her weapon at him, her voice cold and steady. "Stay down." He blinked rapidly, trying to regain his focus. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Someone who's shutting you down," Sarah replied. "Now, hands where I can see them." Silas complied reluctantly, raising his hands in surrender. Sarah secured his wrists with zip ties and began searching him for communication devices. Outside, the gunfire was beginning to subside as the smoke cleared. The rival buyers were retreating, their vehicles screeching out of the compound. Sarah activated her earpiece. "Abby. I've got Silas. How's the perimeter?" "Looks like the buyers are pulling out," Abby responded. "The Serpents are regrouping, but they're still disorganized." "Good. Keep monitoring. I'm moving Silas to a secure location," Sarah said. She pulled Silas to his feet and guided him toward the rear exit. The operation was far from over. But for now, she had the upper hand. With Silas in custody and the deal disrupted, Sarah had dealt a significant blow to the Iron Serpents. The next phase of her mission would hinge on what information Silas could provide, and whether the Serpents would recover from the chaos she had unleashed. Sarah secured Silas in a corner of the warehouse, his wrists bound tightly behind his back. He glared at her. A mixture of anger and defiance etched across his face. Despite the situation, he remained composed, his military training evident in the way he assessed his surroundings. "You've got some nerve coming in here and disrupting my operation," Silas spat, his voice cold. "Your operation is over," Sarah retorted, her voice firm. She crouched in front of him, locking eyes with the former colonel. "Now you're going to tell me everything. Who's backing you? And what's the connection to the Serpents?" Silas chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You think you've won, don't you? You have no idea how deep this goes. Try me," Sarah challenged, pulling out a knife and cutting away a patch on his jacket. Beneath the fabric was a concealed pocket containing a small encrypted communication device. She pocketed it and leaned in closer. "You can either start talking now, or I let your associates think you sold them out." Silas's eyes hardened, but he remained silent for a moment, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "You're chasing shadows. The Serpents are just pawns in a much larger game. People far above Maddox are running this." "Who?" Sarah demanded. Silas smirked. "Ever heard of Rebecca Hale?" The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Rebecca Hale, the architect, had been a ghost in intelligence circles for years. Former Delta Force, presumed dead, and rumored to be behind several covert arms networks. Sarah's thoughts raced as she pieced together the implications. If Hale was involved, this wasn't just a regional gang problem, it was an international operation. She's the one who set this up, isn't she? Sarah pressed. "And Cooper? What's his role?" Silas's grin widened slightly. "Ah. So you've already figured that part out. Cooper's more than just your handler. He's been feeding information to Hale from the inside. You didn't really think your agency was clean, did you?" Sarah's stomach tightened. The warning message from Cooper suddenly made more sense. If he was compromised, every move she had made could have been monitored. She had to assume her entire mission had been at risk from the beginning. "Where is Hale?" Sarah asked, her voice colder now. Silas chuckled again. "You think she's just going to show up because you want her to? She's 10 steps ahead of you. Always has been." Sarah resisted the urge to strike him. Losing her composure wouldn't help now. Instead, she stepped back and activated her comms. "Abby, get ready for extraction. We need to move." "Understood. The perimeter's clear for now, but I'm seeing movement near the south gate," Abby responded. Sarah glanced at Silas. "We're leaving. You're coming with me." "Good luck with that," Silas sneered. "You won't make it far." "We'll see." Sarah shot back, hauling him to his feet. She guided him toward the rear exit, keeping a firm grip on his arm. The warehouse was quiet now, the earlier gunfire having died down. In the distance, she could hear vehicles revving as the Iron Serpents tried to regroup. Outside, the night air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Sarah moved swiftly, keeping Silas close as she navigated through the shadows. Her mind remained focused on the larger picture. Hale's involvement meant that the stakes were higher than ever. If Cooper was compromised, she would have to cut off all official channels and rely solely on her instincts and trusted allies. As they reached a concealed path leading away from the compound, Abby's truck came into view, idling quietly with its headlights off. Sarah pushed Silas forward and opened the rear door, securing him inside with zip ties around his ankles to prevent any escape attempts. Abby gave Sarah a tense look as she climbed into the passenger seat. "You got what you needed?" "More than I expected," Sarah replied. Silas confirmed that Hale's pulling the strings, and Cooper's part of it. Abby's eyes widened. "Rebecca Hale? The architect?" "Yeah," Sarah said grimly. "This just became a lot more dangerous." Abby nodded, starting the truck and steering it onto a back road away from the mill. "So what's the next move?" "We regroup, analyze the intel we have, and figure out how deep this goes," Sarah answered. "We're not done yet. Not by a long shot." As the truck sped away into the night, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The mission had shifted dramatically, but she wasn't about to back down. Hale had made a critical mistake by underestimating her. Now, Sarah had the upper hand, and she intended to use it. The web of deception was unraveling, and Sarah Cross was ready for the next battle. Sarah sat in the dimly lit corner of a remote diner, her eyes fixed on the entrance. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee at the counter. She had chosen this location for its isolation, less chance of being overheard, and easier to control the situation if things went sideways. The door swung open, and Nathan Cooper walked in. He scanned the room before spotting Sarah. His demeanor was tense, but he forced a smile as he approached. Sarah didn't return it. "Sarah," he greeted, taking a seat across from her. "This better be important." "It is," Sarah replied flatly. "You've got some explaining to do." Cooper's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "What's this about?" "Silas," Sarah said, watching his reaction closely. "He told me everything. About you. About Hale." Cooper stiffened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he said nothing, but Sarah saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly what she was talking about. "Look," he finally said, keeping his tone measured. "I can explain. But you have to understand, this isn't as simple as you think." "Then start talking," Sarah demanded. "Because right now, all I see is betrayal. You were supposed to be my handler, someone I could trust. And now I find out you've been working with the same people I'm trying to stop." Cooper exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not that black and white." "Sarah." "Yes. I'm involved with Hale. But it's not what you think. She's not just some criminal mastermind. She's more complicated than that." "Complicated?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "She's running an arms network, using gangs like the Iron Serpents to traffic weapons." "How is that complicated?" "She's doing it to maintain balance," Cooper explained. "You have no idea what kind of threats are out there. Governments, rogue factions, there are forces moving in the shadows that would tear everything apart if we didn't act first. Hale's network is a necessary evil. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Necessary evil? How many people have died because of her operations? How many more are going to die because you decided to play God? It's not that simple. Cooper snapped, his calm facade cracking. You think you understand the bigger picture. But you don't. We're trying to prevent something far worse. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made. Sacrifices like me? Sarah shot back. Was that your plan all along? Use me as a pawn to cover your tracks? Cooper hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. It was never personal. You were brought in because you're one of the best. I didn't want you to get caught in the crossfire. But you let it happen anyway. Sarah interrupted. You let me walk into this blind, knowing full well what I was up against. Cooper sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. I didn't have a choice. If I'd told you everything, it would have compromised the entire operation. You'd have become a target. I already am a target, Sarah said coldly. Thanks to you. The two sat in tense silence for a moment. Sarah's mind raced, replaying every interaction she'd had with Cooper throughout the mission. The subtle misdirections, the half-truths, everything now made sense. He had been manipulating her from the start, feeding her just enough information to keep her on track without revealing the full scope of the operation. What's Hale's next move? Sarah asked finally. Cooper shook his head. I don't know. She keeps her plans compartmentalized. Even I'm not fully in the loop. Sarah didn't believe him. You expect me to trust anything you say at this point? No, Cooper admitted. But you need to understand, Hale isn't your enemy. She's trying to protect the world in ways that most people can't comprehend. Sarah's expression hardened. I've seen enough to know that whatever she's doing, it's not about protection. It's about control. Cooper opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. He leaned back in his seat, defeated. I can't change your mind. Can I? No, Sarah said. But you can do one thing for me. Stay out of my way. If you don't, I'll bring you down along with her. Cooper gave a bitter smile. You always were stubborn. I've had to be, Sarah replied, standing from the table. Goodbye, Cooper. She didn't wait for his response. As she exited the diner, the cool night air hit her like a slap to the face. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Cooper's betrayal had cut deep, but it also crystallized her purpose. Hale's network had to be dismantled, and Sarah would stop at nothing to see it done. Sarah returned to the safe house, her mind still reeling from the confrontation with Cooper. She had spent the entire drive back replaying his words, trying to make sense of his justification for working with Hale. No matter how he framed it, betrayal was betrayal. The weight of it sat heavily on her shoulders. As she entered the house, Abby was already waiting in the living room, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. She stood from the couch, taking a step toward Sarah. You're back, Abby said softly. What happened? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then let out a weary sigh. It's Cooper. He's been working with Hale. Everything Silas told us was true. Abby's eyes widened. Wait, what? Are you serious? Sarah nodded, moving to sit on the edge of a nearby chair. He admitted it. He tried to justify it by saying they're fighting hidden threats, that Hale's network is somehow necessary for global security. Abby crossed her arms, pacing the room in frustration. Unbelievable. And he expects you to buy that? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel. It means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story.